On an ordinary Tuesday morning, a father walked into a bank carrying more than paperwork. 5 years of sacrifice folded into a single check. $5 million. A number that made the teller's fingers freeze mid-motion. Something about the man standing before her didn't fit the story already forming in her mind. In one swift motion, years of hard work were torn apart. Not because the check was false, but because of what she assumed the moment she looked at him. Every eye in that lobby watched a man's dignity get tested in real time. But what none of them knew, including the manager herself, was exactly who was about to walk through that door.
And then, in front of every stunned witness, the most powerful man in that building did something no one expected. He called the humiliated father Sir.
If you have ever been judged before you even opened your mouth, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because what happens in the final minutes will remind you why some of the Hars Muturiatist power, and if stories like this move you, take a second to like this video and subscribe, because there are many more waiting for you. Marcus Bennett had learned a long time ago that mornings were the only hours that truly belonged to him. Before the world woke up demanding things, before his daughter Amara needed her hair braided and her lunch packed, before his phone buzzed with 100 messages from people who wanted a piece of his time, the early hours were his. He used them to think, to plan, and on that particular Tuesday, to prepare for what should have been one of the proudest moments of his life. 5 years earlier, Marcus had been sleeping in the back room of a friend's auto shop, raising his daughter alone after her mother left them both without so much as a note. He had been a mechanical engineer by training, but after being laid off from a manufacturing plant during a wave of corporate downsizing, no one seemed interested in hiring a black man in his 30s with a gap in his resume and a toddler to raise. Doors closed so often that Marcus stopped knocking and started building his own. He took the severance package he had been given, every dollar of it, and poured it into a small idea, a patented cooling system for industrial batteries that solved a problem plaguing electric vehicle manufacturers. He built prototypes in that auto shop at night while Amara slept in a playpen beside his workbench. He ate the same meals for months to save money. He missed birthdays of his own, sacrificed relationships, and buried himself in work because he refused to let his daughter grow up the way he had, wondering if her father would ever catch a break. The breakthrough came slowly, then all at once. A regional manufacturing firm licensed his patent. Then a larger company came calling. 18 months of negotiations later, Marcus signed a licensing and acquisition deal that would change his life. The check in his hands that morning represented not just money, but 5 years of missed sleep, skipped meals, and quiet, unshakable belief in himself when no one else believed in him. He had chosen First Union Trust Bank because it was close to Amara's school, a decision made for convenience rather than reputation. He had no idea that the manager running that branch was about to become one more obstacle in a story already full of them. Diane Whitfield had managed the downtown branch of First Union Trust for 11 years. She prided herself on running a tight operation, on catching fraud before it happened, on protecting the bank's reputation, but somewhere along the way, her instincts had calcified into something else entirely, a kind of profiling she never admitted to herself, dressed up in the language of caution and due diligence. When the teller signaled her over that morning, whispering about a $5 million check, presented by a man in jeans and a simple button-up shirt, Diane did not see a successful engineer who had built something remarkable from nothing. She saw a red flag. She saw a story she had already decided was suspicious before she asked a single real question. She called Marcus into her office, her smile thin and practiced, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. She asked him where the check came from. He explained calmly, patiently, that it was payment from a licensing agreement with a manufacturing company, that his lawyer had reviewed every document, that the funds had already been verified by his own accountant. Diane nodded along, but her questions kept circling back to the same suspicious undertone, as if she were waiting for him to slip up, to reveal the story she had already written in her mind. She asked to see his identification twice. She asked where he worked, as if a man could not possibly own a patent worth this much without a corner office and a nameplate on a downtown building. Marcus answered every question with more patience than the situation deserved, because he had learned, painfully, over years of similar moments, that anger would only confirm whatever bias was already forming against him. Then Diane picked up the check, studied it one final time, and told him that First Union Trust could not process a check of this size from what she called an unverifiable source. Before Marcus could respond, before he could offer to call his attorney or his accountant right there on the spot, she tore the check cleanly in half. The sound of paper ripping in that quiet office felt louder than it should have, loud enough that a few customers near the door turned their heads. Marcus sat frozen for a moment, staring at the torn pieces on the desk between them. This was not simply money. It was 5 years of his life, of missed moments with his daughter, of nights spent doubting himself, all reduced in a single careless motion to 2 pieces of paper. He did not shout. He did not slam his hand on the desk, though every muscle in his body wanted to. He thought of Amara, waiting for him to pick her up from school that afternoon, and he thought about the example he wanted to set for her, the kind of man he wanted her to remember when she grew up and faced her own version of rooms that did not want her in them. He gathered the torn pieces of the check with steady hands, folded them carefully, and placed them in his jacket pocket. He stood, thanked Diane for her time in a voice that gave away nothing, and walked out of her office into the open lobby where a dozen strangers had already begun to whisper. Word moves fast in a room built on marble and glass. By the time Marcus reached the center of the lobby, most eyes were on him, some sympathetic, some simply curious, a few clearly agreeing with whatever conclusion Diane had reached. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the same feeling he had known since childhood, the exhausting weight of being watched, judged, and measured by a yardstick that never seemed to apply to anyone else. He had almost reached the front doors when they swung open from the outside, and a man in an every respect in immaculate navy suit walked in with the kind of presence that made the entire lobby shift its attention. Robert Callahan was the regional director overseeing 23 branches across the state, a man whose name appeared on internal memos far more often than his face appeared in any single branch. He rarely visited this location, but that morning he had come specifically because of a meeting scheduled with a major new client the bank had been courting for months, a client whose upcoming deposit accounts and business relationships were projected to bring the branch significant new revenue. Robert scanned the lobby out of habit, the way any executive does, cataloging faces, reading the room. Then his eyes landed on Marcus, and his expression shifted from polite professionalism to unmistakable recognition. "Mr. Bennett," Robert said, closing the distance between them in a few long strides, extending his hand. "I am so glad I caught you. I was hoping to introduce myself before our call next week." The lobby, which moments earlier had buzzed with whispered judgment, fell into stunned silence. Robert Callahan, the man whose signature appeared at the bottom of every major branch decision, was greeting this humiliated stranger not with suspicion, but with the kind of respect reserved for someone whose business the bank desperately wanted to keep. Marcus shook his hand, momentarily caught between disbelief and a strange, quiet vindication. Robert explained, loud enough for the surrounding lobby to hear, that Bennett Thermal Systems, the company Marcus had built from that back room of an auto shop, was in advanced discussions to move all of its corporate banking, payroll processing, and business accounts to First Union Trust, a relationship that would be worth millions in deposits and fees over the coming years. Robert had personally reviewed the account proposal the week before and had been looking forward to meeting the founder in person. Diane Whitfield, who had followed Marcus out of her office to make sure he actually left the premises, stood frozen near the teller counters, the color draining from her face as she realized what she had just done. The man she had dismissed as an unverifiable risk, whose life savings she had torn in half without a second thought, was the very client her regional director had been courting for months, a client whose business could have transformed the branch's entire quarterly performance. Robert turned to her, his expression unreadable, and asked simply what had happened. The silence that followed told him everything he needed to know before Marcus even opened his mouth. Marcus, to his credit, did not use the moment to humiliate Diane the way she had humiliated him. He explained calmly what had occurred, showing Robert the torn pieces of the check still folded in his jacket pocket. He did not raise his voice. He did not demand an apology. He simply told the truth, the same way he always had, and let the facts speak for themselves. Robert's jaw tightened as he listened, and when Marcus finished, Robert turned to Diane and asked her to step into her office, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. What happened behind that glass door remained between them, but within the hour, Robert had personally issued Marcus a replacement check, drawn immediately from the bank's own verified systems, along with a formal written apology on First Union Trust letterhead. He offered Marcus a private meeting with the bank's executive private banking team, an offer extended not out of guilt, but out of genuine recognition of who Marcus was and what he had built. Marcus accepted the meeting not because he needed the validation, but because he understood something important. Walking away entirely would only let people, like Diane, believe their assumptions had been right all along. Staying, succeeding loudly and visibly within that very institution was its own quiet form of justice. News of the incident spread through the company within days, not because Marcus sought publicity, but because a young teller who had witnessed the entire exchange could not stay silent about what she had seen. A regional newspaper picked up the story a week later, framing it not as a scandal but as a conversation starter about bias in financial institutions, about how easily a man's success could be dismissed by a single assumption. Marcus was invited to speak at a banking industry panel about inclusive lending practices, an invitation he accepted reluctantly at first, then embraced once he realized how many other small business owners, especially those from communities historically overlooked by traditional banks, had similar stories of their own. Diane Whitfield was formally reprimanded and required to complete extensive retraining on equitable customer service practices, though she kept her position after a lengthy review, in part because Marcus, when consulted by Human Resources, requested that the situation be treated as an opportunity for education rather than pure punishment. It was not forgiveness exactly, but it reflected the same principle that had guided Marcus through the entire ordeal, that meeting cruelty with cruelty rarely changed anything, but meeting it with unwavering dignity sometimes did. A year later, Bennett Thermal Systems had grown into a company employing 40 people, most of them hired from the same working-class neighborhood where Marcus had once slept in the back of Red's, an auto shop with his infant daughter beside him. He established a small business fund, specifically designed to help entrepreneurs from underserved communities access startup capital without facing the kind of institutional bias that had nearly derailed his own journey. He often told Amara, now old enough to understand the story, that the torn check sitting framed on his office wall was not a reminder of humiliation, but a reminder of exactly how far quiet perseverance could carry a person who refused to let one bad moment define an entire life. And every time someone new walked into his company nervous about being judged before they had a chance to prove themselves, Marcus made sure they knew, without question, that in his building they would always be seen for exactly who they were.